Dr. Habermas has authored, co-authored, and edited, again, a shelf of books. A shelf of books, including titles such as The Case for the Resurrection, Beyond Death, and Dealing with Doubt. He has spoken widely at various universities, colleges, and seminaries, including Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, and he's lectured a number of times for us at Loyola University. Our students remember him and love him dearly. Clearly is one of the world authorities on the topic of the historical Jesus and the resurrection, and his topic tonight is Resurrection, Evidence That Changed a Generation of Scholarship. Dr. Gary Habermas.
Glad to be with you folks tonight. Since there's a little bit of rivalry here among schools, you didn't mention Houston either.
I didn't see the banner.
Yeah, but I will say this, he wants to start a PhD program. We've had one for about 7 years. PhD in apologetics. In fact, we've already graduated about 15 people. We have 100 people in the program. So, if you want a really good school, no. Glad to be here with you. This is a very special occasion because I just enjoy the opportunity to minister. Apologetics is one thing. I mean, we often think that apologetics, philosophy, and a few other fields kind of feed the mind. But I started getting convicted probably 20 years ago, and it's been growing over the years, that if apologetics doesn't translate to ministry, we're not doing our jobs. And if we're not uplifting Christians, and if we're not, I love Greg Koppel's line, if we're not putting stones in people's shoes, where they might go away and be thinking about the things we talk about, I think we're not doing our job. Now, I'm also prejudiced because I think clearly the single most important evidence in the New Testament that's used for the truthfulness of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection comes up in over 300 New Testament verses. It's related, it's not just the two big topics, it's not just related to salvation, the indispensable part of the gospel, but it's also the number one evidence in Scripture, but it's also tied to almost every area of theology, and it's also tied to almost every area of practice in Christianity. It's because Jesus has been raised, this follows. And you can put almost anything there. Because it accredits the words of Jesus, so you want to know what Jesus taught. There's history that backs it up, and so on and so on. I used to have a student years ago. I have to always stop and think where I am. I guess if you go somewhat due north of here. I'm from Detroit, and if any of you are from Detroit, you may agree with me that Detroit's a great place to be from. But I did live for 3 years in Montana. And I had a student while I was in Montana. And he wasn't the best student we had, but he's a pretty cool guy. I really liked him. He was friendly, just wasn't a good student. And he said to me one time, I taught church history in those days. I had a full load of apologetics, but I did teach a couple of church history courses. And you know how history exams look, right? With a lot of blanks, names and dates. And he said, whenever I take one of your exams, true story, whenever I take one of your exams and I don't know what word goes in the blank, I put the word resurrection. And I know I will get at least half credit. Now, the reason he would get half credit is because Habermas thinks the resurrection is related to everything. So I have to think about, what it's got to do with Luther or Calvin or something. But I mean, sure, they must have said something about it, so we'll give him half credit. And when he took my exams, he usually got half credit. In fact, one of the last exams he took for me, he went down the true false. I don't think he even read it. He just went TF, 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 TF. He got to the fill in the blank and he wrote resurrection, 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 resurrection. Flipped the page, resurrection, resurrection, resurrection. Did it about 6 times and turned the rest of the exam in blank. So you got like an 18 or something. That same school that I was teaching at in Montana, they put a skit on one night, and it was kind of a spoof on professors. And my son, who was just a little tiny guy at that time, they said in the skit, not a true story, but they said, yeah, we saw Rob walking down the street, and we said to Rob, Rob, beautiful day, isn't it? And Rob said, what does that have to do with the resurrection? So you know, my kids were getting around the house. Well, the resurrection is just that central. And with the resurrection, I think Paul says this, 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 20. With the resurrection, we have everything in Christianity. Without the resurrection, we don't have Christianity. It's all or nothing. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. I'm talking about evidencing the resurrection. And I'm going to talk about a method that I worked on, developed, whatever, in my PhD dissertation at Michigan State. I have to stop too and think where I am before I say Michigan State. We're playing the Buckeyes tomorrow, so this is, I made sure my wife taped it today.
Go Spartans. Go green.
Go green. Thank you. Now I'm in a better mood. I don't think we're going to win. So I was in Michigan State, and about half my committee thought the resurrection was, had a good chance of being true, and the other half of my committee definitely did not believe it. And the person that was the most complimentary of my dissertation was a Jewish history professor. And I had to satisfy, with my dissertation, I had to satisfy the history department, religion, and philosophy, because my degree was in history, philosophy, and religion. And as I left the meeting where my topic was approved, the head of the program, who did not believe the resurrection, said to me, he said, I don't care if you do the resurrection. He said, you know, we're pretty liberal around here, but we're liberal in the good sense. We don't care what you do as long as it's defensible. We don't care what side you come down on, conservative, liberal, whatever. Just do it for a reason. And he said, therefore, don't tell us the resurrection happened because the Bible said it happened. And he started to walk away like, have a good day. And I thought, don't tell me it happened because the Bible said it happened. Now, I'm going to explain probably the most important single point in the minimal facts argument that I kind of molded around his challenge that day. And the minimal facts argument, people don't understand this point. I would say on college campuses, at secular groups, I will say, I am not going to assume the Bible is inspired. Because for my purposes, if it isn't, it doesn't make any difference for my argument. But I'm not even going to assume the Bible is reliable. Because if the Bible is unreliable, you can still get this argument. So I call this argument the heads I win, tails you lose argument. And I say this on campus all the time, and anymore it's kind of a neat thing when I go to state universities. I'm often co-sponsored by a Christian group on campus and a free thinkers group on campus. They both sponsor me. They've both been given flyers out. In fact, I was at the University of Iowa a few months ago, and the other side had t-shirts on, University of Iowa Atheists. And they helped pass the brochures out. They didn't know this that night, but one of their faculty sponsors is a well-known skeptic, Evan Fales. He's a very well-known philosopher. And that night I ended up having dinner with Evan, and he and I hit it off just incredibly. You would have thought we were Vietnamese buddies. I mean, we were laughing and cutting up and joking around by the end of the night. And after I gave the lecture, same one I'm going to give here, I said, Evan, he sat in the front row right about there. I said, Evan, why don't you come on up afterwards, and you can have 10 minutes to respond to my lecture. I won't even talk, and then you and I can dialogue up here in front. He said, I'll do it. And the atheist part of the group that was sponsoring me, they were just so impressed. And people heard them before the meeting, they were saying, they asked Evan if he wanted to come up. They're going to give Evan a slot up here. And they just thought it was so cool that we would give them a say. There were like 800 people there for this thing. And we dialogued. When it was over, we had a photo shoot. It was hilarious because he would like hang on my shoulder and make faces, and it was a great time. But I truly believe that if you're going to minister and use something and take it, you can catch more flies with sugar or honey than you can with vinegar. And so I try to befriend the folks that I chat with. And so he knows this argument, and I use this. I used it for the dissertation. And the point is, when I say this, when I say I'm only going to use verses which critics allow, I'm only going to use texts, and then I say I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 15. Here's the response from folks who don't understand what I just said. And they're usually the mythicists. I could stop here and say something about mythicists, but I won't do it. I'm really biting my tongue. But they think I'm doing a bait and switch. They think I'm saying, I'm going to give you evidence for the resurrection. All right, let's turn to the Bible. So they go, I feel cheated. I feel cheated. Why? Because you act like you're not going to use the Bible, and then you do. No, they misunderstood the whole argument. My committee at Michigan State, they did not care if I used the New Testament. So what about what your advisor said? You can use, just don't tell us it happened because the Bible said it happened. That's the key. Don't quote verses and say that settles it. You can use all the verses you want, but only use verses that follow and satisfy critical principles. If you go to Bart Ehrman's works, best known critic in North America, if you go to Bart Ehrman's works, if you don't cite verses, he will. He'll use more verses than you use. So here's the difference. You may cite them because they're in your book and you believe your book's inspired. That's fine. But he cites them because they stand criticism from applying rules to the text, critical rules. So I'm only going to use two texts tonight. Virtually every scholar now, not people who call themselves scholars who aren't, they're writing blogs from their parents' basement. And all of a sudden, because they got a blog, they'll tell you they're published authors. Folks, you know how common this is. And then there's a lot of anger that goes along with it too. Since they don't have arguments that refute your arguments, you present arguments, they present anger. They don't understand the argument. Critics, Bart Ehrman will let me use the text I'm using tonight. I'm only going to use 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And the end of Galatians 1, beginning Galatians 2. Now remember, there's no chapter dividings in the originals. I'm not talking about Psalms and so on, but the New Testament text, there's no chapter dividings. So the end of Galatians 1, end of Galatians 2, just a little stretch right there. And 1 Corinthians 15, just the first 11 verses. Both of these are geared or called by scholars the authentic Pauline epistles, or as Bart Ehrman calls them, the undisputed Pauline epistles. Now, how many of Paul's epistles, in case you're interested, this would be a footnote, how many of Paul's epistles are undisputed? Well, of the 13 books that bear his name, 7 of them are granted by everybody, scholars, no matter how critical they are. No matter how critical. Bart Ehrman will give you all 7 books. G.A. Wells, by the way, who may be the best known of the mythicists, will give you 8 books. And they're the same 7 plus 1 more. Critics don't just give 7 of Paul's books, they give the same 7. And that's important. And if you're here and you're a pastor, and you decide to preach on Paul, they're probably going to be the books you choose from Paul. Because they're the most, generally thought to be the most important Pauline epistles. Here's the 7 authentic epistles. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. I'll repeat them. So, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Okay, one more time. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. Now, in case you wonder, G.A. Wells, the mythicist, he'll give you Colossians too. So that makes 8. But everyone grants the 7. Now, what do I mean when I say they grant 7? What do they think? They don't think those books are inspired, do they? No way. Do they think they're reliable? Not usually. What are they then? I think probably the best word would be authoritative. What's authoritative mean? Well, let's think about this. We know the author. Now, they'll usually say, unlike the Gospels, because most critics will say we don't know the authors of the 4 Gospels. That's another matter. But let's say we know who wrote these 7 books. We know the guy is very well trained. He's a scholar. He is honest. It's obvious from his writings he has a moral code and creed. He's honest. And he might be wrong about something, but he won't knowingly lie. He will tell you what he believes is true. And this may be the most important point. He has been with the original eyewitnesses who walked and talked with Jesus through the whole ministry. That's why Paul is so important. That's the sense in which it's authoritative. And they will say he's the closest, critics will say he's the closest we have to Jesus himself. Because again, they'll say that we don't know the author of the 4 Gospels. Paul's books are also the earliest. Now James might be a little bit earlier, the Epistle of James. And Galatians and James might be about the earliest, at about 48. But for the most part, Paul's epistles are the earliest. So earliest to most authoritative. I'm going to use those 2 texts tonight. In order to do the minimal facts argument, I'm going to use only facts that pass 2 rules. The first one is by far the most important. The second one is just convenient. In fact, if 2 ever changes, 1 is plenty to pull this off. Reason number 1, I will use no fact tonight that is not multiply evidenced from different angles. You say, well, like how many different angles? Well, let me give you an example. Bart Ehrman, of all people, you know, one of the most important rules to establish New Testament text is independent attestation. How many sources do you have that report this? In the ancient world, as Paul Meyer, professor, well, retired now, emeritus professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, as Paul Meyer says, in the ancient world, 2 sources often are often enough to prove an event. 2 in the ancient world. Bart Ehrman, just doing multiple attestation, not all the other evidences you might have, but just on multiple attestation, Bart Ehrman, best known critic, lists 12 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. 12. I'm working on a magnum opus on the resurrection. I'm projecting this thing at 3,500 pages, 3 huge volumes. I've written 800 pages. I've got another 1,000 that are written, but they have to be edited. So that's about half the book, half the 3 books. And I just finished the section on the evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. Evidence for the crucifixion. The material is just under 100 pages long. That's how much data we have for the crucifixion, and why scholars like John Dominic Crossan and, well, I'll just name a couple. John Dominic Crossan, I'll pick on Ehrman again, or we can use the British scholar Maurice Casey, who's another agnostic. James Crossley, another agnostic. They would say it's probably the best attested fact in the New Testament. 100 pages of evidence. That's how solid it is. Now, crucifixion doesn't prove resurrection, obviously, but it's a prerequisite for resurrection, so we need it. I'm going to start there tonight, in just a minute. I'm going to spend the rest of the night walking off the timeline here, and crucifixion is going to be down there. So, how many of you have seen this timeline lecture before, either online or in person? Okay, a lot of you. How many of you have seen this more than once? A lot of you. Anybody seen it more than 3 times? A lot of you. Okay. Why are you here?
Love you.
Thank you. Thank you. What is your name? Pardon?
Todd. Todd. T-O-D-D. Todd.
You know what? I am deaf.
Todd.
Todd. time. I had literally lost 75% of my hearing. So my wife told me 100 times, don't go out of the house without your hearing aid. I have only put it in one ear because this ear doesn't work whether it's a hearing aid or not. My dad said I should fill it with cement and ignore it. I walked that house. I brought a spare battery, but left the hearing aid on the table. We sat down, I'm asking how many of you have heard this. Todd was already sitting here when I sat down. He said, are you doing the timeline lecture? And I said, I am. He goes, good, I love that thing. In fact, I've given that lecture before. So that's what we want to do. There's nothing difficult in this lecture. It's just, history. It's just that there's a lot of data. But you can give it to anybody. I have given this lecture to as young as 11-year-olds, a class of 11-year-olds. Given it to a class of 14-year-olds. And I gave a Shroud of Turin lecture, which is, close, to second graders one time. And of course, they paid attention because all the photographs were bloody. So they thought it was cool. All right, so that's the first principle. We'll only use data that's multiply evidence. The second one is, because it's multiply evidence, think about the topic tonight, the resurrection evidence that changed your generation. The second one is, critics, a very high percentage of critical scholars will allow all of my facts. They'll allow them. Well, how do you know? I love it when skeptics do that at universities. How do you know? And I'll say, I counted. Have you? Years ago, I started with a list of 1975 to date, all the important resurrection books. My bibliography is 3,500 sources long. I went through about 2,000 of them in detail. I took notes on where scholars were on 140 subtopics on death, burial, resurrection. And the notes on where scholarship alone are 1,200 pages long. I'm just saying there's a lot of data out there. But I know head count. I know about where people are percentage-wise. And so the second principle is most scholars will agree with you. What percentage? Well, I'm going to use just a half dozen facts approximately tonight. And 90-some% of scholars agree with them. The main ones I'm going to use, the fact that there was a crucifixion and that the disciples thought they saw Jesus alive after his death. Those two are probably the most widely allowed facts in the New Testament. And I would say the percentage of admittance among critics is between 95 and 99%. So my argument is, each fact is attested by multiple evidences, and that's why the critics allow it. Now let's say starting tomorrow, critics don't grant it anymore. They're tired of allowing it, and people keep getting them in the corner because they allow the data. And they go, I don't allow it anymore. Bart Ehrman just recently changed his view on the empty tomb. He used to allow the empty tomb. He was starting to admit too many things. And so in his last book, he tells you why he changed his mind. Let's say they all start changing their mind. The first reason is the most important. I will only use facts that are multiply evidenced from a number of different angles. All right? One more illustration, and I'm going to start on the timeline. 2 summers ago, I was dialoguing with James Crossley. James Crossley is an agnostic New Testament professor. He calls himself an agnostic unbeliever. He says belief-wise, he's about exactly where Bart Ehrman is in the States. It's very well known in England. By the way, he's an agnostic. You know when he dates the Gospel of Mark? He did his dissertation on this. He dates the Gospel of Mark to about 40 AD. His mentor, Morris Casey, dates Mark to 40 AD for totally different reasons than James Crossley does. So there's 2 sets of reasons for 40 AD. And Crossley puts Matthew at 50 to 60 AD. They predate evangelical dates. So we started the dialogue, and the moderator said that we did 2 short dialogues. The first one was called "The Minimal Facts Evidence of the Resurrection of Jesus." And by the way, this is on the Unbelievable program. You can get them online. We were both live in the London studio. And Justin Briley said, the minimal facts indicate that the resurrection occurred. He said, Gary, how many facts you can use today? I said, I'm going to use 6. I changed the numbers because critics will give you more than the number I use. So I'll just play musical chairs, and depending on who I'm talking to, I'll take different facts, as long as they're from this group of well-attested ones. He said, okay, 6, go ahead. I named the 6. I didn't even give any evidence. He said, okay. He said, James, what do you think? And just like this, James Crossley said, I'll concede all 6 of them, no dispute. Just like that. And then Justin, moderator, said, okay, good way to start. And James said, can I say one more thing? And Justin said, sure. And he said, these are not just well-attested facts, these are the best attested facts in the New Testament. So that's the note we started on. Now let's see what you get from this, okay? Only use facts that are well-attested by multiple evidences, and because of that, virtually everybody agrees. Let's start down here. Now this is creation down here. This is crucifixion. Down there is 2016. And in between, for the most part, at first I'll do a little more data here, but for the most part, my line is only going to go about 25 years. All right? Okay, so Jesus dies approximately 30 AD. 30 AD is a great year. It's the most popular year, probably because it's a nice round number. Scholars don't give a date real often, because it's kind of irrelevant to them. The next most popular year is not 29 or 31. Next most popular year is 33. You have to get the moon right for Passover and everything. And you have to ask how many times this happened in April, and what years are they, and so on. It's like 27, 30, 33. All right. So Jesus dies about 30 AD. I'm going to call this ground zero, because we're going to go plus and minus. Well, not minus. We're going plus from this point. Okay. Now, if you ask the average Christian, what's the evidence for that event? And they're going to say, well, we've got the Gospel of Mark. Now, I'm going to use critical dating, okay, to show you that doesn't really make any difference if you use the critics' dates or evangelical dates. They're going to be either very close to the same or only a few years later, not enough to change anything. And if you go with the critics' dates, Mark said about 70 AD, or plus what? 40. Plus what? Plus 40. Plus 40. Great for ancient history. 40 years. Super. They put Matthew at about 80, or plus 50. Or Luke at about 85, or how much? Plus 55. And everybody puts John at about 95, or how many years? 65. Now, you can stop right there. And 65 years is fine for historicity. I mean, even in modern times. I remember hearing about a man who was doing his memoirs for World War II, and it was in the early 90s. That would be 50 years after the fact. That would be right about where Matthew or Luke are. That's fine. No one's going to say, you're a liar. Nobody can remember things for 50 years. I won't embarrass anybody here, but how many can remember things from 50 years ago? And you know the crazy thing about some of them who raise their hand, they're not even 50. Okay. No problem remembering things from 50 years ago. It's not an issue. In fact, Bar Ehrman, when he lists sources for the historical Jesus, do you know how far he goes? 100 years. He goes from 30 AD to 130 AD. Well, guess what? All 4 Gospels are in there. Now, we could give reasons for this, but that would be the reliability argument. That's the other way that evangelicals argue for the Gospels, or the New Testament. And let me just say, I have no problem with the reliability argument. I don't think it's strong, but I think it's a good argument. And it complements a minimal facts argument. A reliability argument is a top-down argument. It goes like this. The reliability argument basically says, if this is a reliable book, I can basically trust everything in it. Minimal fact says, we won't spread we won't put the roof out there quite that broadly to catch everything underneath it. We're going to build from the bottom up, one fact at a time. So if the reliability argument is kind of a roof spread over the facts argument, the minimal facts argument is a brick wall built one brick at a time from the bottom up, with every brick being a fact. If you want two illustrations of what I'm doing. The Habermas goes 100 years, so we're fine. Now, I debated a pretty well-known atheist. By the way, last summer I had 2 rounds with Michael Roos, very well-known atheist. But a few years ago, I was dialoguing with Vic Stinger. He's deceased now, but you might know Vic Stinger, pretty well-known atheist. And we were dialoguing, and we're in the dialogue part, and he got to speak before me. We had 2 lecterns up here, and we're about 15 feet away. And he said, the Gospels are lousy sources. They can't be believed. They're way too late after the events they record. And it bugs me. I get kind of steamed a little bit when people say things. I don't think he was saying anything that he thought was false. He probably thought it was true. But it bugs me when people give false data and speak like it's true. Especially because there were about 500 there. It was at New Orleans Baptist Seminary. It was on a Saturday. And a lot of those guys are seminary students. And I know what happens to people when they have grounds for doubts. I've written 3 books on doubt, and know what happens. And I can't stand someone saying something, so it was my turn to say something that's not true. So when it was my chance, I said, so the Gospels are too late, right? He said, yeah, they're too late. Can't be much true, can there? Can't be much true. So what do you think about Alexander the Great? Yeah, good source. Well, how much do we know about Alexander? A lot. Do you? Yeah, a lot. Do you have any idea how long Alexander comes after the sources come after his death? Nope, he didn't know. Yeah, well, don't debate it, you don't know what you're talking about. If this is Alexander's death from about 320 AD, here's the earliest. There are earlier written sources, but we don't have them. Here's the earliest source, and I don't mean a inscription in a rock, I mean a good-sized text. Here's the earliest source for Alexander's death on this timeline. Earliest source. Now Mark, we know, is too late. We know he's too late. He's too late. John's too late. But Alexander, he's special. I'll get back to the front. The first source for Alexander. One time I went up the side door. The door locked. I had to bail on me back into the sanctuary. The earliest source for Alexander is just under 300 years. But everybody knows the Gospels are way too late to be good. But I like Alexander. And then here's the comeback right away. Skeptics say, yeah, but there's a problem. Difference. You think the Gospels are history. They're not. They're religious propaganda. How do you know? Because they report miracles. And I'll say, well, wow. I'm sure glad Alexander is straight history. Because here's how Plutarch's Alexander starts. It's commonly believed that Alexander was the son of a god. His mother was a virgin. I'm glad we're not. So now we're not only doing, 300 years later, we're doing theology for Alexander. And I said almost 300, it's about 280 for the earliest source of Alexander. The best sources for Alexander, Plutarch and Arrian. plus 4.25 to 450. 4.25 to 450. That is 10 times the difference between Mark and Jesus. 10 times. But it's good. Gospels are lousy. Okay. Well, I believe this argument can be developed, but I'm going to do a different one tonight. And this is the minimal facts argument. I'm going to go over on this side of the line. Because if this is Mark at 70, I'm going to start with Paul at 55. Or, plus what? 25 years. 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 5, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and following. Well, let me back up. First two verses. Paul says, when I came to you Corinthians, now, he writes the book here. The date he comes to Corinth may be the strongest attested date in the New Testament. And he comes to Corinth about 51 AD. You know how we know? The New Testament tells us who is, we call him the mayor, who's the head of the city of Corinth. And now we found an inscription in a rock that we know when he was the mayor, and they're only there for 1-year terms. And he was mayor from 51 to 52 AD. All right, so Paul says, when I came to you guys, I gave you the gospel. Footnote. Whenever the gospel, the factual side of the gospel, is given in the New Testament, it's mostly in the writings of Paul, epistles of Paul, the book of Acts. There's always at least 3 historical facts mentioned as part of the gospel. The deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Deity, death, resurrection. Deity, death, resurrection. Without that, you don't have the gospel. Deity, death, resurrection. A lot of Christians like to say, death, burial, resurrection. Nothing wrong with that. Burial is mentioned a few times in the context, but it's only mentioned comparatively few times compared to deity. So, well, how do you get deity? How do you get deity? Because titles are used. Here's a great example. Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Now notice what's there. Lord, raised, dead. So, deity, death, resurrection. And what's really cool is 3 verses later, and verse 13, Paul says, with the mouth we believe, with the heart we believe. He's proclaimed with the mouth. And he quotes Joel, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. In that text in Joel, do you know what the name for God is in the Old Testament? Jehovah. So when he says, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, how much Lord? Jehovah. It's pretty high Christology. Son of God, died for his sins, rose from the dead. Lord, died for his sins, rose from the dead. And there's the human side. What are you going to do with them? Have you said, I do, to Jesus? I use that phrase because in the West, that's, well, many parts of the world, that's the closest we have to an affirmation of total commitment. You know the words, better or worse, rich or poor, sickness and death. I mean, in sickness and health till death do we part. That's commitment. And Paul says, have you done that with Jesus? Now, this one is a doctoral dissertation, but I'll just tell you the conclusion. In the New Testament, there are dozens of passages which are early creedal passages, synonyms, almost synonyms, they're not quite synonymous, but almost synonyms would be creeds, traditions, or confessions. And they are the answer to this question. I think it's the most exciting question in the New Testament. Here's the question. Of what did earliest preaching consist between the years of 30 and 50 AD? I think it's the most exciting question. How far back does this resurrection message go? of what did earliest preaching consist before there was a single New Testament book? Now, what do you do when you don't have a New Testament book? Well, it almost doesn't make any difference, because most New Testament scholars today believe that up to 90% of Jesus' listeners were illiterate. 90% of Jesus' listeners may have been illiterate. Now you folks tell me, if someone's illiterate, think of a little child. If someone's illiterate, could they know the words to Just As I Am? Could they know the words to Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound? Could they know the words to a little ditty like Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after? And they can't read? But they know the little poem or little whatever? Yep. They can sing the song? Yep. That's how they taught in the early church. They did things in short synopses so that people could remember the most important facts even when they couldn't read or write. And there's dozens of these in the New Testament. Paul tells you there's one here. It's 1 Corinthians 15:3. He said, I delivered unto you that which I also received, and listen to this, as of first importance. I gave you what I received as of first importance. Nothing's more important than this. He says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Christ is the title. Was buried, rose again from the dead the third day according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And here comes a list of appearances to three individuals, three groups. Now Paul attaches his name to the end. Everybody agrees he adds his name to the end of the list. But he makes the third individual, Peter, James the brother of Jesus, Paul, and three groups. There's the 12. There's a group called all the apostles. And there's a group which he identifies as the 500. And he says 500 brethren. Like the feeding of the 5,000, which says men, there would have been 8,000 people there if you count women and children. And if he literally means brethren, and not just using the male sense there, it could be 500 men, it could be 800 people at that appearance. So that's good to remember. And Paul goes into this list. All right. Paul says, verse 3, I gave you what I was given. When did Paul receive this material? This is the part I can't unpack for you today. We could work on that for a whole lecture or a whole dissertation. But critics, remember the name of the lecture, Change of Generation? Critics believe today. In fact, there's more than one source that says the consensus New Testament position, is that Paul received this material at about +5. +5. Folks, there's like nothing like this in the ancient world. +5. This is when Paul hears it. Now, how do we know this? Well, now oftentimes in my lecture, somebody will say to me, I don't remember Paul telling us the date. Well, do the math. Flip to Galatians 1:18. He said, when I met the risen Jesus, I didn't go running right up to Jerusalem to meet those who were apostles before me. But 3 years later, I did go up. Okay, let's do it. Cross. He meets the Lord. When is this? It's usually said that he met the Lord. Here's another way to ask it. How late is Acts 9 after Acts 1? And his conversion is usually placed at +2 or +3 after the cross. So the first move after the cross, +2 or +3. Then he says 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem. 2 + 3, 5. 3 + 3, 6. right here, 5.5, 5 or 6 years, Paul was up there. He said, I stayed for 15 days, and I saw none of the apostles except James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. How'd you like to have been a fly on the wall? Seriously, when Jesus appears to his brother, James, the unbeliever. By the way, we talked about multiple attestation. We have multiple attestation for James being an unbeliever. Mark chapter 3, John chapter 6. That's multiple attestation. Now, if it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, that counts as Mark. If you haven't had this before, just take a seminary class. I'll tell you the difference. But John is a separate source. So Mark and John are two sources. And they say James is an unbeliever. There's 2 texts for James. And pretty bad. James and his brothers thought Jesus was nuts. I'm not just making that up. The Greek says they thought he was beside himself. 2 minds. He's not the Messiah. Sorry. And then they tried to take him out of the way so he wouldn't embarrass anybody, like his family, because he was in the hometown in that passage. How'd you like to be there? And James is, I don't know, maybe a carpenter. He's out back and he's working, and Jesus appears. Says, bro, check it out. Those are scars. You know who I am? What would you do if you were James? Then he steps forward and he goes, touch me. Give me a hug. Remember the verses in Luke when he later sees the apostles? They said they're terrified or frightened, suppose they've seen a ghost. That's King James. And he said, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see me have. Touch me. Go ahead. And we know the story of Thomas. Falls on his feet. My Lord and my God. Then there's Peter. He denied his Lord 3 times. And here's his Lord. Feed my lambs, Peter. That was later at the lake, but here I am. How'd you like to be one of those guys, James or Peter? And he sees him here for 15 days. Now, there's a Greek word in this text. Galatians chapter 1, verse 18. The Greek word is hysteresai. Hysteresai. The Greek root word is H-I-S, if you transliterate, right? Greek doesn't have Arabic letters. H-I-S-T-O-R. That's the Greek word from which we get the English word, what? History. Now we can't jump the gun and say, because it's the Greek word from which we get the English word history, that means history. But I'll tell you, there's been, that I know of, at least 3 lengthy word studies done on that, all by non-evangelicals. And here's what they say about histore, the root word. It means to check something out in person. I would say the best meaning, maybe, for histore is what many of us in our local towns see on the 10 or 11 o'clock news whenever you get it in your area. And so many of them. How many news programs start like this at night? Eyewitness news. And you know, the implications are, we're bringing it to you right now. We know, because we're there. And yes, there's a big hurricane down in Florida, but we got somebody on the scene. It's Geraldo Rivera. He always likes to be in storms. You remember in the old days, he always liked to be in the heart of it to show you it was something for you. Okay, that's eyewitness. That's eyewitness news. Histore. Hysteresai. I was with these fellas, +5 or +6. And what were they talking about? Don't forget the theme of the book of Galatians. It's only 6 chapters long. You just take the theme in about 1 sentence. It's all about the gospel. Don't get it wrong. Don't add to it. Don't subtract from it. Give it the right way, or it's heresy. You understand? Go. That's it. The gospel. If they're talking about the gospel, they've mentioned the resurrection. And who better to ask about the appearances than James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul? By the way, this is quick, but 14 years later, Paul goes back up to Jerusalem. And who's there? James is still there. Peter's still there. And John is there. Of course, not to mention Paul. Why are those four important? James, Peter, Paul, John. Maybe somebody else was present. Could have been Peter, Paul, and Mary. Seriously, she was probably there too. But they're there. And what's so important about these big four? They are by far the most influential Christians in the early church. If you want to go to the most authoritative person in the early church, go to one of those four. Two of them are part of the 12, Peter and John, and two are later made apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both unbelievers and skeptics of different sorts. Four. And what are they talking about? Galatians 2:2. I went up 14 years later. Critics put this about 48 AD, so about plus 18. I went up about plus 18. I presented to the apostles the gospel I was preaching. Why? To see if I was running or had run in vain. Well, what? Well, yeah, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is why Paul's works are so important and so authoritative. The best thing Paul gives us is that he knew these guys. And he asked them about the resurrection appearances because he set before them the gospel. There's no gospel without resurrection. They had to discuss resurrection. Habermas says, Paul spent, now he's talking about that one, but he says Paul spent 15 days with the eyewitnesses. And then Bart says, I'd like to spend 15 days with Peter and Paul. Is it Peter and James? And then Habermas says this, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony in the New Testament than right here? It's the best insider's track if you want to present eyewitness testimony. It's because James, John, and Peter said so. Now, Paul was a witness too. So that's 4 eyewitnesses. All right, into the argument here. Paul gets this at plus 5 or plus 6. But watch carefully. This is when Paul heard it. This isn't how old the creed is. This is when Paul heard it. If he got it from Peter and James, which is a consensus New Testament position, they had the testimony before he had it. And the events on which the testimony is based are earlier still. We're right back to the events themselves. Habermas, this is why critics call these pre-Pauline creeds. What's a pre-Pauline creed? The earliest of them? What's a pre-Pauline creed? Here's the cross. When's Paul converted? What's pre-Pauline? Right there. That was a pre-Pauline creed. Meaning, it was around when he was saved. Paul didn't invent this message. Paul comes on the scene. It already existed. It's pre-Pauline. Habermas dates this material, several forms of it. New Testament, he probably dates maybe 6 different forms of it, to 1 to 2 years after the cross. You want good data? +1 or +2. Go, the critics believe this? Yeah. Habermas is 1 to 2 years. James D.G. Dunn is influential as any historical Jesus scholar today. James D.G. Dunn says, the latest it could have been formulated into Mary had a little lamb, into that form. He says the earliest latest would be about 6 months after the cross. Larry Hurtado says days after the cross. Bart Ehrman is actually liberal at 1 to 2 years. Jimmy Dunn says 6 months. Larry Hurtado says days. And I'll add this. I haven't mentioned naturalistic theories. The critics are trying to come up with naturalistic theories. They all crash and burn on facts I have mentioned in this lecture without going anywhere else. Just these facts alone. There'll be empty tomb in here. It's not as well accepted by scholars, probably 75%. I gave a lecture at ETS a few years ago, 21 arguments for the empty tomb. 21, with 2 sources are enough to establish events in the ancient world. What about 21? That's the data we have for the gospel. So let me just end with this. My time's up. Folks, the importance of this text is that, I told you the New Testament resurrection mentions almost every area of theology. The doctrine that is connected to the resurrection of Jesus more than any other doctrine is the fact that because Jesus is raised, we will be raised too. Almost 20 times in the New Testament. John says we shall see him as he is and we shall be like him. Paul says he will raise our vile body to be like unto his glorious body. We will see him as he is, we'll be like him. Let me stand with this thought. In 1992, I watched my wife die of stomach cancer. By the way, many of you know that Nabil Qureshi has stomach cancer. Please remember him in prayer, but if you haven't heard yet, he got an incredible report yesterday from a PET scan that most of the cancer has disappeared. Now, whether God's healing, whether he's given him more years, we don't know what's going on. But I know what this is about. He and I had to talk about this the other day. I watched my wife die 4 months after diagnosis from stomach cancer. And it was also 20 years ago, and things weren't as knowledgeable. Tell me, or tell Michelle, Nabil's wife, tell people who are supposedly losing their loved ones according to the stats, tell them it doesn't make a difference whether Jesus is raised from the dead or not. The most touching card I got when my wife was sick, I couldn't even repeat the words for a whole year afterwards. It said this: what are you going to do when you get to heaven and walk with your wife down the golden streets, hand in hand by the river of life? I couldn't even read the words, let alone say them to somebody, because they were so precious to me. That's the difference between the resurrection of Jesus being true and the resurrection of Jesus not being true. If it's our time and we go, we're going to the best place in the world. Paul said, Philippians 1:21 and 23. He said, it's far better to die and be with Christ. Far better. That's the message we have, folks. We want to live forever. That's the hope of humankind. And it's promised as a by-result of the resurrection of Jesus. I leave with you tonight the words of our Lord Jesus Christ himself, John chapter 14, verse 19, who also said this: because I live, you shall live also.